हेलो।
हेलो हेलो।
आ रही है ना?
PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry symbolizes progress, harmony, and development. For the last 116 years, PhD CCI has been serving the nation. PhD CCI reaches out to 150,000 companies with focus on the development of large, medium, and small businesses. PhD CCI has co-opted national and international industry associations and organizations through over 151 global MOUs and more than 60 domestic MOUs. With access to governments and international forums, PhD CCI ensures that the voice of our members is heard by those who make decisions that ultimately affect their bottom line. The mission of the PhD CCI is to provide a proactive leadership role by providing quality services, to act as a catalyst for rapid economic development and prosperity through promotion of trade, industry, and services, to strengthen technological advancement through effective industry-government research partnership, to emphasize productivity, improve work ethos, and encourage business ethics, to effectively project credibility and commitment of business to the society at large. To support its members, the Chamber has expert committees, state committees, and task force. PhD CCI brings together intense research, ideation, and advocacy to support businesses. They support the members proactively through intense research and advocacies. Not only members, they also support the government in formulating prominent policies that support economic growth. With this, the Chamber brings out a unique opportunity to network nationally and internationally. PhD at its headquarters in Delhi and its regional offices at Chandigarh, Jaipur, and Lucknow provides unique facilities for conferences and business networking events to its members. Prominent services of the PhD CCI are ideation and research on topical issues through expert committees and task forces, advisory services to business on corporate affairs, taxation, finance, capital markets, etc. Certification services for origin of goods for exporters and other documents, capacity development through trainings and workshops, interface services with central and state
A very good evening to all of you. Today's program on inflation, open house discussion on inflation is very crucial because now everyone is hit by the high inflation, starting from businesses, then organizations, people. And inflation is now going up and up. And RBI has decided to increase the rates, and already they have increased the 90 basis points during the last 34 days. So I think this is the most impactful move by the Reserve Bank of India during the last 10 years after the Lehman crisis, when we observed inflation in the double digits at 13%, 14%. So we have great experts, those who are known not in India but internationally. Great economist, renowned economist, Dr. Pranab Sen, Program Director, India Program, International Growth Center, and former Chairman, National Statistical Commission, and our respected Shri Subhash Chandra Garg ji, former IAS, author of the book The $10 Trillion Dream, and former Finance and Economic Affairs Secretary, Government of India. Then we have Dr. Gurbachan Singh, a great analyst, eminent economist, and faculty with the Indian Statistical Institute. And our chairman, Dr. Vijay Mehta ji, senior managing committee member and chairman, MAFCOM Capital Markets Limited, and alternate president, NME. And we welcome you all for sparing your valuable time to discuss this crucial juncture, that how to move forward, how the RBI is going to take more and more moves, and what should be the strategy to tackle inflation, not from the demand side, but addressing the supply issues so that economy becomes more and more prudent, and we are able to achieve our anticipated growth rate of around 8% and to become $5 trillion economy in the coming times. So with these words, I would like to request our chairman, Dr. Vijay Mehta ji, and congratulations, sir, for getting the degree of doctorate, and many congratulations that he has. So I would request our chair, Vijay Mehta ji, to present a plant to Dr. Pranab Sen. Again, I would request Chair Vijay Mehta ji to present a plant to our guest, Shri Subhash Chandra Garg ji, eminent economist and author of the book. And I once more request Shri Vijay Mehta ji to present a plant to Dr. Gurbachan Singh. So we have, because this program is virtual come physical program, hybrid program. So we have presence of the virtual participants of more than 80. So they are also observing all the deliberations. So because this is an open house discussion, so everyone can put their respective ideas how to tackle the inflation. If they have great ideas to address the inflation, the youngsters, they should come out how the inflation is impacting their pockets, because that is also a great impact on the students and on the professionals, and they are, I think they are impacted more as compared with the any other segment, because they have the limited sources of the incomes. So with these words, I would like to invite our chair, Shri Vijay Mehta ji, for the welcome remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. A very good evening to all. On behalf of PAG Chamber of Commerce and Industry, I would like to again welcome our very distinguished panel of speakers, Dr. Pranab Sen, Shri Subhash Chandra Garg and Professor Dr. Gurbachan Singh, and of course our Chief Economist, Dr. S.P. Sharma. I would also like to welcome all those who are associated with us in this program online, and I'm sure that we will also receive questions from them. The geopolitical developments in the last 2 months have created a volatile and ambiguous economic and business environment. Globally, economies worldwide are facing headaches because of increasing cost of living and downgraded outlook of economic growth. At the backdrop of rising prices of commodities, including fuel and food, shortages of key raw materials, and stressed supply lines, governments and central banks around the globe are trying to tackle heightened inflationary risk in synchrony with raising interest rates, amendments in duty structures, etc., thus maintaining a delicate balance of consequences for economy, trade, and finance. Presently, India depends on imports to meet up to 85% of its crude oil needs. The surge in international oil prices to a 14-year high had resulted in broader price pressures. Higher cost push inflation is weighing on all economic agents, household, businesses, as well as the government. Especially MSMEs are facing the issues of declining production possibilities, reduction in anticipated sales volume, heightened operations and logistic cost, while individuals are being impacted by rise in the retail prices of petrol and diesel and costlier food and other utility staples. April 2022 has been the fourth straight month in which the retail inflation has breached RBI's comfort zone of 2 to 6% and has spurred rate hike decision by the Reserve Bank of India. Monetary tightening will have an impact on consumption demand and resultant price corrections in the various goods and services in both consumption and wholesale segments. Also, the consequent increase in loan EMIs would impact the consumption sentiments and reduce demand in the economy, which would lead to corrections in wholesale prices. The ongoing depreciation in rupee is another major worry, as it would make India's energy imports expensive and lead to further fuel inflation. The risk of imported inflation has only gone up, with rupee plunging to record levels. The outlook of world GDP growth has been undermined by the geopolitical conflicts, high inflation and renewed corona variants. However, the Indian economy is expected to remain resilient on the back of its inherent strength, strong economic fundamentals, and growth promising sectors. India's growth trajectory is expected to remain steady in 2022-23, supported by various dynamics reforms undertaken by the government during the last 2 years. At this juncture, a continued handholding by the government is required to mitigate the impact of recent geopolitical developments while maintaining a balance between inflation and economic growth. The PhD chamber would like to suggest refueling of consumption demand will have a multiplier effect on production possibilities, private investments, and employment creation. Address the high commodity prices and shortage of raw materials to support the consumption and private investments in the country. Escalation in the international commodity prices should be addressed with a reduction in the excise duties on the key raw materials and easing the supply chains. The petroleum products that stoke inflation to a higher level should be brought into the ambit of GST. Strengthening of the global value chains and shifting of the sources of the imports from higher price to low price countries. Import substitution for the technology intensive and labor intensive products where India has a high imports category and comprises higher import shares. Enhancing indigenous production possibilities where there is high demand for the commodities. Measures for preventing hoarding of the essential commodities to stop price accelerations. As the recovery process has been coincided with the geopolitical developments, economy should be supported with continued reforms for the businesses, particularly for the MSMEs and agriculture sector. There must be a focus on reducing the cost of doing business with ease of doing business and becoming robust at the factory level. Although procedural requirements have been relatively reduced and the communication between government departments has become transparent and hassle-free, however, the cost aspect still needs to be relaxed further. I hope that today's open house discussion proves to be insightful on tracing the inflationary impact on Indian economy, businesses and individuals, and corresponding suggestions to help to move towards a higher growth trajectory of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shri Vijay Mehta ji, Dr. Vijay Mehta ji, for your perspective on the inflation and growth, to balance the inflation and growth, because that is very much needed to move forward with more and more facilitation to the growing young population so that they are able to get their adequate jobs. As when inflation hits, the production possibilities are also impacted, and producers are not able to expand much and to create employment opportunities for the growing young population. So now with these words, I would like to invite our great economist, renowned economist, Dr. Pranab Sen, for his viewpoint on the inflationary developments and how to address such crucial issues so that the economy becomes smooth and attains its anticipated growth rate. Dr. Pranab Sen hold positions such as such as first Chief Statistician of India, acting as functional and technical head of the National Statistical System, Principal Advisor, Power and Energy at the Government of India's Planning Commission, as well as Secretary, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, Government of India from 2007 to 10. Dr. Pranab Sen has received his PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University, specializing in open economy, macroeconomic systems, international economics, and public finance. And he's very supportive to PhD chamber and always comes when we need him. And he provides his viewpoint and always guide us on the various crucial issues of the trade and industry to make representations to the government so that policy environment and ease of doing business becomes favorable, and businesses are able to move forward with more and more thrust for growth. So Dr. Pranab Sen ji, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. May I also thank the PhD Chamber for inviting me for this panel discussion on a very important subject. Let me behave a little bit like a college lecturer and give you a little understanding of what we mean by inflation and how you should think about it. Because there is a lot of confusion in our minds. Almost any increase in prices is termed as inflation. It is not. Let's be very clear about that. Inflation is a process. Inflation is a process which feeds on itself and continues unless an external force is applied to slow it down. That's what we have to keep in mind. So if you think of the discussions and debates that are going around about inflation in India today, everybody is pointing fingers at the global commodity prices. Yes, global commodity prices are high, but the fact is they've been high for a while now. The global commodity prices started climbing up as the COVID pandemic struck. When countries went into lockdown, supply chains got disrupted. That's been 2.5 years ago. And if you look at commodity prices, they haven't changed a whole lot in 2 years. The global commodity prices. There's not much. It went up very sharply in the end of 2021 and has more or less remained stuck there. Not much change. Inflation, on the other hand, has been accelerating across the world. And so the question that you should be asking yourself is, if the cause of inflation, which is global commodity prices, is not accelerating, why should inflation accelerate? I would understand if global commodity prices were increasing day after day. They're not. But all other prices are. And until we have an answer to that particular question and that understand that relationship, it's a little difficult to think of the way to solve it and to in fact understand what the implications are. So let me try and give you a sense of the way I have been looking at it. Now, what is it that has happened? And it's a complex story. It's a complex story which is really rooted in the way that the structure of the Indian economy has changed during the COVID epidemic onwards, and a process of change that continues as far as I can see, even today. And the nature of the change is kind of fundamental. Now, this is something I would have hesitated to say had I been giving this same talk to, let's say, FICCI or even perhaps ASSOCHAM. But PhD chamber, I have a much higher degree of comfort. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that what has happened from 2021 onwards, and the data is fairly clear on this, is that corporate India has gained a huge amount of market share at the cost of the MSME sector. I'm making this as a bold statement. Now that sounds all right, in markets, you have winners and losers, so what's the big deal? The big deal is that when you have such a shift in market share, the overall level of competition in the Indian economy has declined. The MSMEs used to provide that nimble competition which kept corporate India's pricing behavior in check. That particular role is now diminished, and it is diminished quite substantially. Pricing power has moved into the hands of corporate India. And they have been exercising it. The corporate results are there for everybody to see, at least for the listed companies. They're published and one has been looking at them. And the results are really quite stark, which is that corporate India has been continuously passing on cost increases. Indeed, it's been cutting costs in certain directions. So employee costs have actually come down. Bottom lines are up hugely. Top line corrected for inflation, not much. And that's understandable. We have barely gotten back to where we were in 1920 in terms of the overall GDP of the country. So what has essentially been happening is that because of a concentration of economic power in the country, the ability to pass on cost increases as price increases has become much larger today than it was 2.5 years ago. That's what we are going through now. Now, this is worrying. It is worrying because everything that I can see seems to suggest that this is not going to end in a hurry. So I was looking at banking data for the last couple of years, and the data again is quite shocking, which is that in the last 2.5 years, the amount of money lent by banks to the non-corporate sector, and as by non-corporate, I mean the MSME sector, has been almost completely absent as far as term lending is concerned. Working capital lending has continued, term and lending virtually stopped. So if you look at the term lending data that the banks have been putting out, it's almost entirely to corporates. What that means is essentially corporate capacities have been going up, MSME capacities have stagnated, and in fact probably fallen, because we don't have an estimate of how many MSMEs died during the last 2.5 years. There are estimates, and the estimates range anywhere from 8% of the MSMEs to 15%. But corporates have been growing, and they have been growing their capacities. One of the interesting indications of this is that despite the fact that corporates have been showing extremely high growth, their capacity utilization continues to remain low. Guess why? Because they're investing faster than the growth of their output. Now, when they do, it means that in the future, corporate India is going to have capacities which will be available to forestall any concerted return by the MSME sector. Now, the question then is, do we resign ourselves to living with a very high degree of concentration of economic power in fairly few hands? Because that's where I think we are going. In a situation like that, any external shock is going to translate into pretty quick inflation within the country. This we are already experiencing, and that is going to be the likelihood in the future. Because at the end of the day, the inflationary process is really about who at the end of the day will bear the cost of the increased prices that are coming from abroad. It's the distribution of that pain that's important. How much should be borne by the companies, how much should be borne by the consumers, and how much should be borne by the government? It is that distribution which ultimately determines the extent to which this process can reproduce itself. One of the things in all of this, of course, is the role of the RBI. That initial increase in global prices may not have resulted in this kind of inflation had there not been this hugely accommodative monetary policy, which we had since April of 2020. That permitted inflation to happen. And inflation has been around in India now at least since the middle of last year. RBI waited just too long to act. In my opinion, they should have acted somewhere around November or December of last year. They did not act. And then now they have been forced into a position where they're having to overreact. So there's going to be too much increase in the policy rates in too short a period of time, which means that we should be prepared for further shocks which will be coming from the interest rate side. As it is, interest rates have been moving northwards. So if you look at the 10-year government bond yields, they've moved up dramatically. They had gone down to 5.9%. They are now upwards of 7.4%. So it's moved up already very substantially. And this is going to continue to accelerate. So cost of funds are going to be problematic. The corporates have already tied it up. They've done it in the past. But the MSMEs who will now be trying to come into the market, take it from me, your job is going to be that much harder. I'm sorry for being the bearer of bad news, but that's how I see it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us on various crucial issues related to inflation. And your speeches are always eye openers, and we always act on that and implement in our policy advocacy. As you rightly said that RBI should have acted in November, December. This is too late, and overreacted that they increased the policy rates by 90 bips in the 34 days only. That is a great shock to the particularly to the MSMEs, those who were not prepared to bear this shock. They were already impacted by the high cost of doing business because of the high cost of raw materials. So now moving ahead, firstly, I would like to request our dignitaries on the dais to release a report on inflation prepared by the PhD Research Bureau of PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry, in which they have suggested various suggestions to address the inflationary scenario. I would request all the dignitaries. Thank you very much, dignitaries on the dais, for releasing the report on inflation. So now I would request our esteemed guest, Shri Subhash Chandra Garg ji, ex-IAS, author of the great book of US dollar 10 trillion dream and former Finance and Economic Affairs Secretary, Government of India. He served various important positions, and he has experience in the policy and program implementation in finance, agriculture, and general administration at Government of India, State of Rajasthan, and district and at the sub-district levels. He has also been the author of a great book that already mentioned, and he was also advisor to the Honorable Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh. Recently, he has written this great book, and we would like to hear from him about his thoughts, which are always proactive for the growth and development of the economy. As we observed during the last many years, he spoke at the PhD chamber platforms many times and provided suggestions on the crucial issues as and when they come, and we prepare the representations for the Government of India for the suggestive measures and implementation. And all those suggestions given by him during the last many years have been proven very important for the growth trajectory of the Indian economy. We always appreciate his writings in the various important newspapers and magazines, and we read them and implement in our various crucial policy matters. Thank you very much, and I invite Shri Subhash Chandra Garg ji.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma. It's a pleasure to be with the chamber again and listening to Dr. Sen and to be followed by Guru Bachan Singh. So I do express my views. So these days I write on the moneycontrol.com. So yesterday also I wrote a piece on the RBI policy. And today we are discussing the impact of inflation on economy, businesses and the people. So let me give you my take where I stand on this. My sense is that the inflation is much deeper than what the consumer price index sort of tells you. It's about 8% in April. But if you look at the wholesale price index, it has been more than 13-14% for quite some time. Consumer price index does not really measure the entire set of inflation, something like 30-35%, especially of the investment goods, which the businesses are more concerned about, is better measured by the wholesale rather than the retail price or the consumer price index. If you look at also the GDP deflator, so 8.7 real increase and 19.5% nominal GDP increase will tell you that the general inflation is over 10%. So this excessive sort of emphasis and visibility on the consumer price index has tended, in my mind, to number one, under visualize or underrate the inflation problem in the economy, and secondly, possibly not acting. The wholesale inflation has been there for last 13, 14, 15 months. So we did not sort of take any action on that. We simply ignored it. So only when the retail price inflation started going beyond 6%, then only we try to act. So that's number one. We should actually be looking at the right kind of measure, and the extent of the inflation problem is much, much deeper. Second thing to my mind is both the major policy makers. Inflation is to a great extent a policy problem as well, besides the dynamics of the demand and supply, which is the primary determinant of the inflation. And the policymakers can make some difference. So the biggest policymakers are the government and the Reserve Bank. In my judgment, again, both the policymakers tended to ignore the inflation problem for quite some time. If you read the RBI's monetary policy statement of February and of April, in February, RBI said the retail inflation would be only about 4.5% in 22-23. And as late as April, it was 5.7%. Only yesterday they said 6.7%. So in 4 months, if you revise inflation estimation by 50%, from 4.7% to 6.7%, either you're not measuring the inflation correctly, or you are deliberately ignoring it, hoping that possibly this will be transitory and will go away. I think this tells me that possibly we were not very serious in acknowledging the inflation problem and trying to act about it. Inflation is, to my mind, greatly because of the global supply and the demand disruption and mismatch. Post-COVID, almost all over the world, the stimulus and the kind of money which was thrown at the people was so massive that it gave a big boost to the demand, whereas the supply got disrupted. And that massive demand to the demand push and supply disruption caused the inflation problem in the first place. If you care to look at last 20 years of the Western countries or the advanced countries policy, they were trying to get 2% inflation, and they were not succeeding. And by these measures post-COVID, you find that the inflation has now become 40 years highest inflation in US and elsewhere. Yesterday, Europe also crossed about 8% inflation. So this big push of demand and the supply disruption over the, and we were impacted by it, we were drawn into it. India cannot remain an isolated country where the global inflation is there and India can remain isolated. We also took advantage of the global demand and our exports went up. We also imported, but our exports primarily went up, not because something we had become greatly competitive or we had become very efficient in exports. It was sheer pull of the global demand, which was getting imports into the world and exports from here. As and when that demand cools off, you would see the exports also sort of cooling off from the country. But what exports did is to accentuate the problem of the supply in the domestic economy further. Because if you export, you're not leaving that much for the domestic consumption, and that is where we did not do, as a matter of policy in the country. We did not have a very large sort of demand push. There was no helicopter money. There was not much of the stimulus to the people. What the government did was only that 500 rupees cash for some time. By and large, otherwise it was distribution of wheat, etc. in kind. So the inflation was not caused by the government pushing up huge amount of demand, but the supply problem, because the exports and all affected the domestic economy. Now, having come where we have come, and this problem is there, the question which is today, what is the impact of the inflation and all this? I think this is a very crucial question, and not much really understood and analyzed by the people very much. Look at what happens. So if your real economy or your real GDP is growing by, let us say, 8%, and your inflation or the nominal economy, nominal GDP is growing by about 20%. So there is a reallocation of the real incomes in the economy. That's what when Mr. Sen was referring to, Dr. Sen was referring to the corporate side. So there are three basic recipients of the income. One is the wage earners or the household, so to say. And the other one is the corporates or the businesses. And third one is the government, which gets the taxes. So the government's taxes have been very good. You saw it. The last year's tax growth was phenomenal. Corporate profits were also phenomenal. So corporates also got, and who got squeezed? It was the households. So roughly, if you, this is, I don't have the data, but in my rough sense, there is about, let us say, 65% share of GDP which goes to the households, roughly about 15% to the corporates or the businesses in terms of profits, and roughly about 20% to the governments in the form of taxes. So if your taxes grow, if your business profits grow, the households will get further squeezed. And we can do the study, but in my sense, that 65% must have come down to 57, 58%. There is 6 to 7% definite loss in the share of the households, which reduces their income and which reduces the demand and consumption, and which makes them further poor, right? Whereas government is not honestly too much affected as a government by the inflation. So you are getting better taxes. Your bond yields in a way don't rise that much as the inflation has gone up. So effective debt goes down. Your expenditure to some extent gets affected, but government's finances are not very adversely affected by the inflation. In businesses, the corporates, and it's not again a kind of universal or same impact on everyone. There are different segments of the corporates getting affected differently. For example, if you look at the commodities companies, the mineral based companies, they perhaps made the best of the profits. Recently, the 5 steel companies, their profits this year were about 87,000 crores, having risen for about 35,000 crores to 87,000 crores, only 5 companies in 1 year. This year, they're expected to go down again back to about 40,000 crores or so. So they were the biggest gainers. The consumer companies did not gain much. They could not pass on the producers inflation, and they did not. And the worst affected were, to my mind, the MSMEs and small businesses who really had no pricing power, so to say, and they were the most affected. So how do we deal with it now? So with different kind of, politically inflation is a problem. You can't have a government who is comfortable with and in terms of finances it might be comfortable, but in terms of its political impact it cannot be comfortable. So it has to do something that is now beginning to be done. So you then start taking some actions which if you've not very carefully thought through, it might appear to be knee-jerk. For example, the ban on wheat export really hurt the poorer households. The farmers will not be able to make that much, take advantage of that profit, which could have come to them. It would, the consumers in any case by wheat were not getting very much affected, because wheat and rice is supplied through the ration system, even otherwise at either free or that kind of. And if you take the actions like sugar regulation only, that will create some conditions of corruption and other kind of things in the economy. So I don't think there should be a knee-jerk reaction. We should very carefully think about what can be done to control inflation, pass on the impact or redress the impact for the households to be better. Last thing, I think there's this one, RBI policy has been very recent. There are two instruments which I see which RBI uses. One is the rate increase, and the other one is to keep the money supply flowing, the credit and the money supply growing. I think RBI is sending very contradictory messages. While one instrument is being hiked, you are raising the rate of interest. The other instrument, while you in words, you are sort of trying to say that we will not use accommodative, etc. But the real intent of if you read between the lines, is that the RBI is going to keep the surplus liquidity into the system for quite some time to come. In May, it was 5.5 lakh crores. And I don't think even in next 3 to 4 quarters, the RBI is going to get into a situation of deficit liquidity. If you keep on supplying the credit and money, even if you raise the rate, while some impact, basically again the households, etc., might get impacted, and they may reduce their the demand for house construction, some consumer durables, etc. Because households don't borrow for consumption. That's not going to be impacted at all. That's what you're seeing, that the demand for credit is not actually reducing. Last month, the year-on-year credit increase is highest at 12% in many years. So if you keep the supply of money on, even if you raise the rate, I don't think it's going to impact the credit growth in the economy. So what I think, let me conclude here, is that we are in the age where the inflation is real. It's much wider and more comprehensive than what we acknowledge. We have been late in recognizing and dealing with it. It is impacting most the households and the people, wage earners than others. The policy response which has started is good, but not adequate. To some extent, it's neither. And the RBI's policy action, to my mind, honestly, is not going to be very effective, as it is a little bit contradictory in my judgment. So as I concluded my piece yesterday, inflation is not going to go away anytime soon. Wait for it, live with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for highlighting the major dynamics of the inflation in India, and your suggestions and your viewpoint about the inflation is very, very crucial, that inflation will remain with us for much of the time. In the coming times also, we have to tackle the inflation and make the strategies to how to move forward. But inflation is really becoming a major challenge for the Indian economy, as we were expected to move forward with more than 8% growth rate and to become $5 trillion economy in the next few years. But now, with the effect of knee-jerk effect of the Reserve Bank of India, now consumption scenarios and production scenarios are also going to be impacted, because when the consumption declines, producers also not able to expand more because demand is not there. They don't want to increase their inventories. So that's why the demand for international commodity also becomes slow. So all this system and economic dynamics are going to settle in the coming times, so that inflation becomes slow and soft in the coming quarters. So with these words, I would like to invite Dr. Gurbachan Singh, eminent economist and faculty at Indian Statistical Institute, to give his insights. He is guest faculty at Management Development Institute, Gurgaon. He was previously at the Center for International Trade and Development, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has also been visiting professor at Ashoka University, and his academic writings are primarily on macro financial stability. This is at the interface between financial economics and macroeconomics. His work is primarily policy oriented with theoretical backing and practical deliveries like the industry bodies. He is currently working on a book on a well-targeted interest rate policy. Great. Dr. Gurbachan Singh ji, we would like to hear from you the policy strategy and how to address this culprit, which is impacting again and again the trajectory of Indian economy. Dr. Gurbachan Singh ji, please.
Thank you very much. That was very nice of you. So my discussion may lean a little on the academic side, relatively speaking, and I may go back a little to history also. So I would like to go back to the global financial crisis. So after the US economy and many other economies were so badly hit, there was a lot of emphasis on stimulus. Stimulus became a very acceptable term. Monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, and over a decade, more than a decade, we had large stimulus. This was in US, even Europe, and of course, Japan had had it earlier. Now, we came to the point where it was being believed that inflation is not a problem. You can spend, you can expand the fiscal policy, you can expand the monetary policy, you can go on. And when we reached the COVID situation, at that time, the situation was bad. And the immediate thought process was that we are in a crisis, the GDP has fallen, is falling, and we have the experience of the last 10, 15 years. Nothing happens. So let us provide that stimulus. Now that happened in the US, that happened, I should say there was less of it in India. We were more restrained. And I remember those days when I was got a little more active in public policy writing. I found myself in a bit of minority because the emphasis was on larger stimulus. So I can understand the concern. The concern was that you cannot ignore spending on the poor, the unemployed, on public investment, etc. So there is a need for that, and which is where I was saying that yes, we need spending on that, but that's a question of allocative policy. You can always have more funds for them at the cost of something else, but don't expand too much. That's where I differed with some of my colleagues in the universities and amongst the practitioners. So the government did well, I thought, in terms of the aggregate stimulus. But where I differed with the government was on the emphasis on where they were spending. The adequate, the components were the difficult part. So I found myself differing with both the government and my community of economists. But what I want to say here is to come back to the inflation part, that there was an environment of complacence. And the mindset was, as I said earlier, provide the stimulus. And it is finally now that we are paying a price. It is most visible in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, but to some extent, even the US, in the sense that considering the kind of economy it is, the high inflation rate, in that sense, even the US is going through a crisis. And for Eurozone to have 8% inflation is, in a sense, as dramatic as the situation in Sri Lanka, given the history and the beliefs there. Now, so one was that part of the story. The other is that there's now we are looking back and we are saying the Fed was behind the curve. We are even saying that the RBI was behind the curve. I am not so sure about that part, because what happened with the fiscal stimulus over very many years was that the debt GDP ratio rose substantially. Now, the interest rates were being kept low, and that was helping the government. But with the COVID, the additional fiscal stimulus, the debt GDP ratio was rising even more. And I have a feeling that behind closed doors, in some central banks, not all, but possibly in some central banks, there was this inside policy of let inflation be. That is one way of reducing your debt to GDP ratio. Now, I don't have a proof for this. This is hypothesis or speculation, but we've seen this happen time and again. I may say that even in the 1970s, the oil price shock was in a sense a bit convenient for the government, because the debt to GDP ratio was falling in the 70s. You have this thing. So I wonder if the Fed was really behind the curve. It looks like it, but it wasn't possibly so. Of course, the textbook story runs in terms of monetary policy, tackling a trade-off between inflation and employment output, but the debt GDP ratio doesn't get that much attention in that standard story. Another thing that I would like to say is about the oil price. Now, of course, oil price has played an important role. By the way, it is what the public is suffering from is the rise in the oil price. Then on top of that, the rise in the oil tax, particularly in a country like India. And then, and this is not well understood, we have the inflation tax. So you have a high oil price, high oil tax, then inflation tax, and no wonder the consumption is getting affected, as both the earlier speakers mentioned. So the public in India is not in good shape. This is not getting shown up because of the aggregate GDP growth and because of the stock market performance, but the public is not doing well. This is evident from the data on consumption. This is evident from the data also on the real per capita income. If I remember correctly, we haven't touched the 2-year back per capita income in real terms. So there is a serious 3%. Yeah. So there we are. Now, so coming back to the oil story. Now, usually we take the oil price rise as an exogenous event, and then that leads to cost push and then general inflation. Now, I have a feeling that the story is not so simple, at least in the recent years. Why is that? Coming back to the stimulus in the US and elsewhere was so strong that it would lead to a big rise in demand, but that big rise in demand would also translate into big demand for oil. So it could be that, now I'm saying something here, which is that the oil price rise could be a consequence of the expansionary fiscal and monetary policies that were continuing for a while. And after that, of course, the oil price jump will have a cost push inflation, which is further accommodated by the central banks for the fear that there would be a slowdown. It was mentioned, so I will say a little about my forthcoming book. I'm working on a well-targeted interest rate policy. I've been at it for a while. So I am hoping to come up with a policy regime where you don't have a blunt policy. So what is the problem currently? The central bank interest rate policy, the interest rates are supposed to be changed for hitting real investment. Reduce interest rates so that aggregate real investment goes up. Now, the aim is real investment, but often it can be interest inelastic. But even if it is elastic, you can have an effect, and possibly a greater effect, on the financial markets. You lower interest rates. I'll give you the classic example. Warren Buffett borrowed huge sums of money at very low rates of interest, long term, and invested in the stock market. What are we doing with the low interest rate policy? Are we helping the real economy, or are we helping the financial markets? It hasn't taken us very far. The low interest rate policy also affected the interest income of the middle class, the pensioners, the retirees, the widows, the NGOs, the resident welfare associations, the endowment funds of educational institutions. Interest income is hardly there for the very rich. They invest in stocks, in real estate. So we have a very, very blunt interest rate policy. And it's not clear if it is helping with output inflation, the standard story. What we need is a different thing, which is what I am trying. The last thing that I want to say is, it is very important to tackle inflation. Let it not go beyond a point. Why? Of course, for the reason, one important reason is the public is hurt. But there is another reason. And coming as I do from the area of financial economics and macroeconomics, day in and out, we complain about assets like gold, an unproductive asset that people invest in, particularly in India. And we are rather contemptuous, following the example of John Maynard Keynes, who said it's a barbaric, barbaric relic to invest in gold. And in India, we get contemptuous of our people, and particularly of women. Now, let's go to the root of the problem. Is it that we are all that stupid? Or is it because bank deposits, where the interest rates are so low compared to the inflation rate, that it actually makes sense to invest in gold? The real return on gold could be higher than the real return on bank deposits. Now, if that is the case, it's a very rational decision to invest in something like gold. Then the emphasis on real estate. Now, come to the latest entry. Latest meaning relatively latest. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. We keep complaining, here we have an asset which is useless. It should be banned. We should not allow it. But why are people going? How did it arise in the first place? This was in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, when the monetary policy was very expansionary and people thought it was going to be inflationary. Now, they were wrong, but at least they were wrong then. There was the fear of inflation. When you have the fear of inflation, then you are coming out with solutions. And as a part of the solution was the emergence of something like a Bitcoin. So Bitcoin was an answer to the problem of feared inflation. Now, instead of banning or condemning Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, we may as well go to the root of the problem, which is high inflation or feared inflation. So let us not have high inflation, and let us even not have the fear of inflation, so that people get away from gold, real estate, and Bitcoin. tackle it at the root. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gurbachan Singh ji, for your insightful thoughts, as always, for the inflationary trajectory to move forward and to address it from the grassroots level. And your measures like macroeconomic indicators like consumption demand and supply side reforms are needed at this juncture to address really the inflationary scenario. So I would request our chair, Shri Vijay Mehta ji, to take a few questions and moderate the session for the question answer session.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sharma. The first question is from my side. And I think I was just about 10 days back, I was in Iran. I was heading a business delegation from PhD chamber. Now the cost of petrol there is 4.5 rupees. With the increase in the cost, they have now made it at about 7.5 rupees. But all over Iran, there are very heavy demonstrations going on against inflation. My point is that is the cost of petrol the cause of our inflation? Number one. Or is it the war which has caused inflation? Or was it the expansion of US economy during the COVID days, which increased the money supply? Or there were many other international factors which fueled the inflation. My question is that whether there is a time cycle by which inflation will come down, or with the stoppage of all these factors or many of them, the inflation will start cooling, or when will the inflation, you think, will reach its logical end, and what will be the factors leading to that? This is my question. Today, I think, I don't know whether if you have been acquainted, the government has shown its intention to stop the import of refrigerators within a month or so. I think that indicates that the government is adopting a policy of stopping the import of luxury goods to some extent, which are otherwise not a manufacturing is not a rocket science, and it can be manufactured here in India also easily, or they are being manufactured. So I want any of you to give me a answer to this question. Maybe.
I think I spoke a lot more than Dr. Sen and Mr. Gai, who is a bureaucrat.
All right. Okay, let me. One of the things we need to realize, Dr. Mehta, is that inflation is not symmetric. So if oil price rise or commodity price rise has set off inflation in India, when oil prices come down to, let's say, 75 rupees or 70 rupees, or commodity prices comes down, it doesn't mean that inflation will follow. It will not go down. Okay, it can continue to go up. It is not a symmetric process, because once it has got internalized, it becomes no longer about the original cost. It becomes an argument about income shares. Who is getting? I mean, this is the point that Subhash was making. That different people, different parts of our economy are trying to protect and increase their incomes, and it is that game which continues the inflationary process. So commodity prices can come down to what they were pre-pandemic, but inflation will not necessarily come down. So inflation has to be tackled on its own right, rather than simply look at the original cause. Okay, that's, I think, the first and most important. The second issue is that there are very few countries, in fact, none that I can think of offhand, which have been able to control inflation without suffering to some extent in terms of growth. If we think we are immune, we are wrong. So in fact, the reason I bring this up is if you listen to the RBI governor's talk yesterday, it was very interesting. He raised the inflation forecast by, I think, 150 basis points, right? And he left the growth exactly unchanged. Do you remember that?
Yes, it was very conspicuous.
I-
6.87.
It remained there, right?
And the growth
Right.
remains the same.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense. If you're going to be bringing inflation down from 8% to 6.7%, growth is going to take a hit. The question is who takes the hit and how do you moderate that effect? And this was the point I think Subhash was making over and over and over again. Who takes that hit? At the moment, if we do nothing and the government continues on its current expenditure plans as they exist post this last budget, the MSMEs are going to suffer. So if we have to think about employment, saying not, let's not protect GDP. That's GDP is not important. What is important is employment. If we have to protect employment, then perhaps we need to rethink not the total amount, as Gurpreet is saying, that's not needed, not the total amount of expenditure, but the deployment of that expenditure. What do you spend it on? Are you spending it in a manner which benefits the large corporates, or are you spending it in a manner which benefits the MSMEs? That is the question, which means that you can't talk about you can, of course, talk about the overall spending, but it becomes more important to actually go down into the granularity of the spending pattern and ask the question, who does it benefit? This is an exercise, unfortunately, we don't do enough. On the expenditure budget, we go by very large items. We go a lot of detail into taxes, but not into expenditures. But we need to start doing that because that's where the solutions are.
Thank you. See, in my judgment, what caused inflation, if we understand and take care of that and sort of re-roll back that, possibly the inflation should come down, because that's the logical. So what's happening? Let's take globally. So the big stimulus raised enormous amount of demand, both from the monetary side and the fiscal side. The US Fed balance sheet doubled to $9 trillion. The government fiscal spending also went up very sharply, which created enormous demand and sucked in from the supply from all over, even despite the disruption. Now that is getting sort of rolled back. The US Fed has shifted this stance now. So you are now seeing balance sheet tightening, as they say, instead of expanding. The fiscal giveaways have also stopped. In last 3 to 6 months, there is no fiscal giveaways in the US. So, which is now, as the projection from the WTO also comes out, that the global trade growth, which went into about 20% or so, is expected to get down to only about 4 or 5% this year. So I think there would be a sort of reduction of the global demand, which should cool down the inflation. The second big factor is the oil prices. Whether we wish or not, oil prices through its multiple channels, whether through transportation cost or otherwise, has a much bigger impact. But oil prices are not a pure demand supply phenomenon, as Dr. Sen was also saying. Um, Despite the global demand overall coming down, which will reduce the oil demand also, the prices may not come down, because prices now are more of a function of how the Middle East and the OPEC countries decide. They have learned this very well, that if you can adjust the oil supply by 1% or 2%, not more than that is required, you can keep the prices high. And they are keeping the prices high despite the demand seemingly now coming down a little bit. And I don't see it going down below $100 per barrel anytime soon. It's 120, and it may remain at that level. At best can come down. So that leaves me to think that the inflation will probably persist much longer. That's what I said when I was saying not before, let us say, one year or so, where you can see the visible impact of the inflation going down in Indian situation to, let's say, 4 to 5% retail. And wholesale, I think we should start watching that. If the wholesale is not coming down to 6% or so, then we have a big problem. So maybe 1 year time is the least time when the inflation trajectory will have seemingly some. But in the meantime, if we can sort of realign our policies to what inflation has done in terms of adverse realignment, killing the demand on the corporate or the wholesale or the bigger goods kind of thing, luxurious and other goods, and increase the production of the smaller or the essential income transfers to them to take care of the that they are able to. I think we will be able to see to deal with in a more equitable manner, equitous manner, rather than the adversarial manner. That's my view.
So I'll just add one line. They've actually answered at length, but just to add one line, the rate of growth of central bank money needs to come down. You were mentioning it earlier. That has to go alongside anything else that we. That is still not happening as was being said. I looked at the growth rate of reserve money for the last 2 years or so. It is, I think, more than 15% per annum. So it is not just oil story or.
So any other questions? Yes. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Vinish Sharma. I'm working with a chartered accountancy firm. My basic question is that why is it that the this interest rate inflation issue crops up only when when the Fed hikes rates, because whenever there are local dynamics involved, simply there are no issues with that. Even this time also Fed is RBI is hiking rates simply because there is a balance of payments issue involved with that, because the government is concerned that there is foreign exchange will come down, that will will put pressure on the rupee. But in case if you look at the last 15-20 years, the purchasing power is already down, the real wages are down, but the inflation is simply not taken into consideration. Even although this, in fact, the basket, CPI basket is very much it does not have the required components which impact the common man. And that is why that we see that this inflation, there is shrinkflation going on these days, where they in the rural market they are not able to get the adequate quantity, but that won't be captured by the data. And second, my second question is relating to the point that the point that was raised regarding the MSMEs not being able to but the government is focusing massively on the startups, unicorns, and there's so much of this low interest rates, liquidity is flowing into unicorns. Simply they want to, but these unicorns basically are not going to be generating that sort of jobs like the MSMEs are going to generate. They do not invest in the hard assets. Look at the issue price. They are they are not able to get the that sort of valuations. Look at the LIC. LIC is completely is tanking at this point of time. So the overemphasis on startups is basically one of the basic issues that is there. Because ultimately they do not relate with the fundamentals. Maybe few of them, but not the entire so would like to have your views on that. Thanks.
Okay. So two questions. One is your sort of diagnosis that this is being done to protect the external value of rupee rather than for the domestic interest rate. I think if you had carefully seen yesterday and even today, the rupee has actually depreciated, not appreciated. Normally, if the interest rates are raised in the economy, the rupee should actually be appreciating, because then the idea is that if there is a higher interest rate in the domestic economy, the difference between the external interest rates and the domestic interest rates goes up, which attract the foreign flows. But it did not happen that way. So the perception to my mind outside is that still we are not at the optimal interest rates, rather than we are actually keeping the monetary policy loose to ensure that the interest rate in the domestic economy remains lower than what is required, maybe for funding the government program and all. So I don't think I would agree with that diagnosis that this is being done to protect rupee. If you want to protect rupee, actually you would have to raise the interest rate much more than what you're doing. The second point which you said about the startups, MSMEs and all, that is true in the sense that the MSMEs being the industrial economy companies will generate more employment and produce goods and services. But the startups actually are nothing more than the intermediary disruption, either let us say in the finance field or the e-commerce companies. They are taking away the inefficiencies of the distribution and bringing down the cost, which is where they expect to make profit later on. So MSMEs will really suffer. I think we should be prepared that either we make MSMEs efficient in the distribution side. You must have watched this big debate, the CAIT on one side, this confederation of retail guys who are trying to sort of see off that the Amazons, etc. of the world don't come in. Whereas the other side, you are seeing the big expansion of the startups, especially in the e-commerce space. And the government is trying to come up with some regulations to control this and that. That is the battle which is for the old economy, which is inefficient, the new economy, which is perhaps more efficient. So either the old economy becomes more efficient. So you have come up with ONDC, which now will allow the small companies to go digital, but there are big problems. For example, policy, if I may point out, even today, if any small, any MSME wants to make even one single sale on the e-commerce platform, it has to mandatorily register under GST, despite the 20 lakh or 40 lakh limit exemption doesn't apply to them, even for one. So what you are signaling is that you can't adopt the efficient means to cut down your cost. And if that is the case, you will remain vulnerable and get out of the business. So I don't see MSMEs actually getting ready for taking the big fight which is coming, or big onslaught which is coming from this startup space.
Yeah, let me just add a little bit to the story about the unicorns. I think it's a little important to realize this. Unicorns and MSMEs access their finances from two very different sources. Okay, and let's be clear. So the question that you should be asking is, how is it that there is so much more money in the hands of the angel investors and the venture capitalists and not enough money in the banking system? That's the question you should be asking. And the answer is there for you to see. You're a CA, right? What has been happening to yields in the capital market versus bank yields? What has happened to the total volume of household savings that have moved out of the banking system and gone into the capital markets? Because that's where the venture capitalists and the angel investors raise their funds for funding the unicorns. That business model is not a interest rate based business model. It's a capital gains based business model. Whereas on this other side, it's an interest rate. So the question here is, don't look at it as unicorns versus MSMEs. Look at it in terms of where the finances are coming from and what is driving the movement in finance. That I think you'll find much more productive in terms of being able to analyze what is happening.
So just to add a little bit on the startups, it's very interesting that on one hand, the startups are being encouraged and seriously encouraged. On the other hand, there is actually difficulty in entering business. So there is a lot of improvement in ease of doing business. But ease of doing business can mean that I am an existing business. It has become easier for me to run the business. Now, what you want is, in fact, more important than that is ease of entering business. Have you ever heard of an MBA from IIM setting up a mutual fund? Just to give one example. So ease of entering business is still not there, and the startups are being encouraged. I wish there was greater consistency there.
One thing more I would like to add, I think, you see, this non-growth of MSMEs, according to me, have been the result of multiple factors. Now, earlier they were facing competition from international side, say China. I know of a lot of units where China was supplying to them lower than the cost of production here. Now, the cost of production here, with the interest rate, high interest rate, with the high distribution cost, and with was said in the beginning by Dr. Sen, with the big corporates entering into their area. So they have a logistic problem of distribution. And then there is a high power cost, high labor cost. The skilled labor is being picked up by these corporates at a higher salary. And MSME, the poor MSME, is left with either the guys whom he has to train himself, who also leave after getting skilled. So this is a plethora of problems which has happened to MSMEs. And unless there is a concerted effort to, at least the government provides them in terms of logistic, distribution, and interest rate factors, I think this problem, I don't see any solution in the short term. The second point which you are talking about, the stock market giving money to all these startups, I don't think any new startup has come to the market because I belong to the market. This whole thing was planned for the venture capitalists to get out. And they took advantage of the high market, though they paid a part of it because when they entered, the dollar was at a lower price. And when they are exiting, they're already, their money is depreciated by, I think, 40% in terms of carrying it back home. And since they have incurred huge losses in other emerging markets, they are compensating in India by selling things over here. There are these issues. I would say that partly they were manipulated and partly they took advantage of the high market uh, uh, craze among the new investors who came to the mutual fund through SIP. I don't think any unicorns have entered the market so far. It's Zomato, which is a couple of years old. Paytm is again couple of years old. But these things happen. There is no direct solution. The problems are so complex and they are so interwoven. According to me, I don't think there is one solution to the Indian economy. Whatever little is being done, it gets negative, it gets neutralized by some of the other factors, which of them, many of them are even beyond our control. So, okay. Dr. Sharma is telling me we are exceeding the limit. So maybe we can have last two questions, Dr. Sharma. Last two questions. One is by you. Anyone else? You have any question? So this is the last question.
I'm K.K. Roy Chaudhary. I'm an environmental engineer. Something is, poking my mind to ask a question. This agricultural agitation having achieved success in the recent past, has it in a way, has it been in a way blessings in disguise that inflation is not rising further? Thank you.
This is an opinion or a question?
Well, there is an opinion in it, which is, so Rajchandri, you mentioned that the farmers have been successful. I think if you talk to the average farmer, he would disagree with you. The average farmer is saying that the farmers' agitation was not successful. That's the common belief. But, look at what is happening. The recent increase in the inflation rate that we've had over the last couple of months has been driven essentially by agriculture. In fact, if you look at this and you look at which are the leading contributors to inflation, on the top 10, 9 of them are agricultural products. Right. All right. So agricultural inflation is still very much there. And I think the appropriate question that you need to ask is that there has been no evidence of any decline in agricultural growth. Agricultural growth has actually been at or around 3 to 3.2% over the last 5 years. So why is it that all of a sudden, out of the blue, agricultural prices have started rising so fast? Agricultural inflation was muted earlier. Now agricultural prices are rising very rapidly. Why is this happening? I mean, can we just go back to the bad old days and say, no, there are people who are stockpiling this, there's hoarding going on. This has always been our litany, that agricultural inflation is all because of hoarding. This is not true. You can't hoard perishables. And again, if you look at the list, it's mostly perishables there. So we really do need to ask, what is causing agricultural inflation today? And we're not talking about small inflation. We are talking about 33% increases in some of the agricultural commodities. What is going on? And unless we have an understanding of this, and we don't have an understanding, it won't be possible to find a solution.
Thank you. Thank you all dignitaries for your very, very interactive session with the audience. Dr. Pranab Sen, our mentor, our guiding force for the trajectory of Indian economy and particularly PhD chamber thought process. Shri Subhash Chandra Garg, as always, he is very supportive for the PhD chamber. Dr. Gurbachan Singh, eminent economist and always providing the insights about the Indian economy, and our dynamic chairman, Dr. Vijay Mehta ji. A very good evening to all of you. On behalf of PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry and my own, it is indeed a pleasure to propose a vote of thanks to this physical and virtual gathering for the open house discussion on impact of inflation on economy, business and people. I would like to convey my deep regards and hearty thanks to all the esteemed speakers and distinct expertise for taking out time from their very busy schedules and interacting with the members of PhD chamber and industry stakeholders. The expert viewpoints and deliberations in today's open house discussion have been truly enriching, interesting and thought stimulating. I would also like to sincerely express my heartfelt gratitude to the members and industry stakeholders for devoting their valuable time for this open house discussion. I would like to mention that PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry has been proactively supporting the policy environment, always at the forefront for any crucial issue at the stage of development, creating awareness and disseminating the knowledge among the various stakeholders of the economy. The Chamber stands committed to the progress, harmony and development of the nation and its facilitation to a conducive environment for a $5 trillion economy in the coming times. I once again thank all the esteemed speakers for gracing this very important program, which has benefited the stakeholders from economy, trade and industry on the dynamic, futuristic economic and business financial developments. Last but not least, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to our respected chair, Shri Vijay Mehta ji, for sponsoring this program to discuss such a crucial issue so that economy, industry, and people are benefited from the thoughts of the experts. Thank you very much. And thank you, dignitaries. Thank you, participants. And thank you for sparing your valuable time. And high tea is served outside the hall. And we request all to join us for the high tea. Can I invite my research bureau team to come on the stage as you have published this book on inflation? Ladies can sit. Now you take the dash. Don't hesitate. नेम प्लेट्स मेरे ख्याल से ऊपर नेम प्लेट्स हटा दीजिए उधर साइड Thank you very much. Thank you.